Today's story begins in May 2014 in the Mediterranean Principality of Monaco. It was here that a woman named Hélène Pastor had built a life many people would live to die for. One shaped by wealth, influence, and discretion. Hélène Pastor was born on August 5, 1937, to Gildo Pastor and Emily Brianti. Even before she was born, her family was already extraordinarily wealthy. Her father, Gildo Pastor, had inherited a substantial fortune from his own father, Jean-Baptiste Pastor, who laid the foundation of the family's wealth through construction and real estate. In the years that followed, Gildo Pastor expanded that fortune even further. He recognized that Monaco's limited space created rare opportunities and struck a pivotal deal with Prince Rainier. The agreement allowed the Pastor family to develop high-rise buildings along Monaco's waterfront, while retaining ownership of both the land and the properties themselves. This deal gave rise to some of Monaco's most prestigious developments, including the Monaco Yacht Club, making the Pastor family the second most influential family in Monaco. Despite her wealthy background, Hélène lived in ways that often surprised those around her. She avoided attention and preferred a quiet, modest lifestyle. Instead of luxury cars or chauffeurs, she often drove through Monte Carlo in an old London taxi, choosing anonymity over display. That same modest nature also shaped her love life. In 1955, Hélène fell in love with a bartender named Alfred Ratkowski. He came from a poor background, and her father strongly disapproved of the relationship. Still, Hélène was deeply in love and chose to marry him anyway. In 1961, they had a daughter, Sylvia. Not long after, the marriage began to unravel. Alfred was convicted of petty theft, and the relationship soon came to an end. Seeking privacy and distance from the press, Hélène moved to London for several years. When she returned to Monaco, Hélène tried once more to build a family life. She married a dentist named Claude Palenka, and in 1967, they had a son, Gildo, named after her father. But the marriage was short-lived. It ended 2 years later, and Hélène never remarried. In 1990, her father died, leaving his empire to be divided among Hélène and her brothers, Victor Pastor and Michael Pastor. While her brothers pursued their own paths, she stayed true to her father's strategy, building long-term wealth through rental properties rather than quick sales. Over time, her portfolio expanded to include some of Monaco's most valuable buildings, including the Emily Palace, the Trocadero, the Continental, and many other luxury developments. This made her one of the richest women in the world and quietly earned her the nickname, the Vice Princess. She was so wealthy that she gave both Sylvia and Gildo a monthly allowance of 500,000 euros. Over time, the money created dependence and attracted people who saw a way to benefit through her children, particularly through her daughter Sylvia. In 1986, at a charity ball in Monaco, Sylvia met a Polish man named Wojciech Yanowski. He arrived well-dressed and confident. On paper, his resume looked impressive. A Cambridge graduate, a hotel and casino operator, and Poland's honorary consul to Monaco. Sylvia was still carrying the weight of a recent divorce. She kept to herself, staying off the dance floor. Yanowski noticed her and approached, striking up a conversation. As they talked, it flowed easily. At one point, he joked about how her mother had once eloped with a Polish man, Sylvia's father, and that he felt as though history might be repeating itself. From that night onward, Sylvia fell in love with Yanowski. The two began dating shortly after and spoke openly about a future together, possibly even marriage. But Hélène did not share her daughter's optimism. From the beginning, she had doubts about Yanowski. He did not fit her idea of an ideal son-in-law. Still, out of love for Sylvia, Hélène chose not to openly oppose the relationship. Sylvia and Yanowski went on to build a life together. Sylvia already had a child from a previous marriage, and together they later had a daughter. Although they never married, Yanowski was widely regarded as Helene's son-in-law. As their relationship continued, Yanowski took on a growing role in managing Sylvia's finances. Of the 500,000 euro Hélène gave Sylvia each month, a large portion was gradually taken over by Yanowski. At times, he inflated the cost of purchases and redirected the excess money into business interests abroad. In one case, Sylvia requested a family yacht. Yanowski handled the purchase and told her it cost 4 million euros, when it had actually cost 3 million euros. In another, he claimed the children's education cost 500,000 euros, when the real amount was closer to 150,000 euros. In 2012, everything was about to change. Yanowski's businesses were crumbling, and to make matters worse, Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer. If Sylvia died, the 500,000 euro monthly support from Hélène would end, leaving Yanowski to face financial ruin. In his mind, one idea began to take hold. If Hélène were gone, Sylvia would inherit a large share of the family fortune, money that could solve his financial problems for good. It was around this time that Yanowski turned to someone he trusted, his personal trainer of nearly 10 years, Pascal Duriac. Yanowski confided in him. He spoke about Sylvia's cancer and described it as a daily family tragedy. He claimed her condition was made worse by her mother, portraying Hélène as cruel and overbearing. He told Duriac that Sylvia was going to die and that something had to be done. Then he made his request. Yanowski asked Duriac to help him find a weapon. In exchange, he offered 140,000 euros. Duriac did not agree. Shocked by what he had heard, he walked away. 2 days later, they met again. This time, Yanowski acted as if nothing had happened. There was no mention of weapons, no talk of Hélène. Duriac began to wonder if he had imagined the entire conversation. But the request had not disappeared. From that point on, Yanowski drew Duriac closer. He invited him to work out at his home several times a week. Their relationship slowly changed. Yanowski became familiar, even affectionate. He spoke to Duriac like a mentor, telling him he was the son he never had. For Duriac, it was intoxicating. Yanowski was wealthy, powerful, and successful. Being taken into his inner circle felt like an honor. Over the following months, Yanowski tightened his grip. He showered Duriac with expensive gifts, luxury watches, opera tickets, trips. Gradually, Duriac began to feel indebted to him. By the time Yanowski returned to his request, Duriac felt unable to refuse. Yanowski pleaded with him. He said he could not go on. He begged for help. And slowly, Duriac began to believe the story he had been told. That Hélène was harming her daughter, that Sylvia was suffering, and that killing her mother was the only solution. On May 26, 2014, Hélène left Monaco, driven by her chauffeur, heading to the Arcet 2 hospital in Nice. It was a routine she had kept for months. Gildo had been hospitalized there after suffering a serious vascular accident. Every day, at the same time, Hélène made the same journey to spend about an hour by his side. That evening, shortly after 7 p.m., Hélène prepared to leave the hospital, unaware that 2 men had already taken position in the parking lot. As her vehicle exited the parking lot and turned onto the road, everything happened within seconds. A man stepped forward and fired 2 shots. One at Hélène, the other at her chauffeur. Inside the hospital, Gildo sensed immediately that something was wrong. Not long after, staff informed him that his mother and her driver had been shot. Both were rushed to another hospital in Nice and placed in intensive care. Their condition was critical. For security reasons, Hélène was admitted under a false name. Less than half an hour after the shooting, the area was sealed off. The crime scene was frozen. Forensic teams carefully examined every part of Helene's vehicle. Bullet impacts on the vehicle allowed ballistics experts to identify the weapon. It was a sawed-off hunting shotgun, an unusual choice, not typically linked to organized crime. On the passenger seat, investigators found Helene's handbag. Inside was 1,800 euros in cash. Nothing had been taken. Police were briefly allowed to speak with her. She was weak, but conscious, and told them she remembered everything. From her hospital bed, she explained that as she entered the vehicle, she saw a man on her right side holding a weapon. She said he then moved closer and fired at her. The interview had to be stopped. Before police left, Hélène said she was afraid and wanted to speak again, saying she still had things to say. She never got the chance. Shortly afterward, Hélène lost consciousness. She would not wake up again. In Nice, the investigation escalated immediately. With both Hélène and her chauffeur killed, the full weight of law enforcement was brought in. Resources normally reserved for major terror cases were deployed. At first, investigators assumed the attack had been carried out by professional hitmen. That theory did not last long. Surveillance footage from the hospital parking lot revealed something unexpected. The two men involved did not act like professionals. Their faces were uncovered. One fired the shots. The other stood nearby, keeping watch, easily identifiable by a red cap. Even more surprising was how they arrived. Taxi cameras showed one man dropped off at 6:34 p.m. 13 minutes later, a second taxi delivered the shooter. Two assassins arriving separately by taxi was unheard of, and it proved to be a gift for investigators. Taxi records led police to two phone numbers. From there, cell tower data allowed them to reconstruct the suspect's movements minute by minute. The trail began in Marseille. On May 6, 2014, the two men bought prepaid phones, activated them near the Canebière, and moved toward St. Charles Station. Surveillance footage showed them boarding a TGV bound for Nice. They arrived mid-afternoon. Phone data placed them at a hotel near the station, where they checked in, showered, and waited. A search of the hotel room led to a crucial break: a bottle of shower gel containing DNA. It matched a known offender in Marseille, Saeed Ahmed, 24 years old, with prior convictions for drug trafficking. The second man was identified soon after. He continued using the phone linked to the crime. His name was Hamadi, 31, also known to police. The shooter and the lookout were now identified. But a bigger question remained. What possible link could connect two small-time criminals from Marseille to one of Monaco's wealthiest women? The answer emerged through intercepted phone calls. As police monitored the men, one name surfaced repeatedly: the white man. He was described as the one with the money, the one who gave orders. Investigators soon identified him as Pascal Duriac, the personal trainer of Hélène Pastor's son-in-law, Wojciech Yanowski. With that link uncovered, the case took a darker turn. What had first appeared to be a cold external hit now looked like an intra-family crime. Attention shifted immediately to Yanowski. As police dug deeper, Yanowski's image began to unravel. Behind the titles and connections was a man whose business ventures had collapsed. His finances were in disarray, and investigators found that large sums of cash had been withdrawn from his accounts in the months leading up to the murder. Phone records placed Yanowski in constant contact with Duriac around key moments. Money, calls, and timing all pointed in the same direction. On June 23, 2014, just 6 weeks after the shooting, police moved in. Yanowski, Duriac, the shooter, and the lookout were all arrested at the same time and taken into custody in Nice. Yanowski denied everything. Calm and confident, he insisted he had nothing to do with the murders. But in another interview room, Duriac told a very different story. He admitted his role and described how Yanowski had slowly drawn him in, through trust, pressure, and money, before asking him to help arrange Helene's death. According to Duriac, 140,000 euros was paid to make it happen. During questioning, Yanowski eventually admitted that he had paid Duriac, but insisted it was not to kill his mother-in-law. Yanowski told investigators he had been the victim of blackmail. He claimed that for nearly 2 years, Duriac had threatened him and his relatives, forcing him to hand over money for protection. After 3 days in custody, his story changed. Yanowski then said he had acted to protect Sylvia. He described himself as emotionally overwhelmed by her illness, insisting that her cancer and her suffering had been made worse by constant pressure from her mother. He told police he could no longer watch the woman he loved endure what he described as emotional oppression. He even claimed that doctors had linked Sylvia's cancer to stress, and that stress, he said, came from Hélène. According to Yanowski, Duriac had acted on his own. Given Yanowski's public position, he said, he could never have been directly involved. Then came a statement that stunned investigators. Yanowski said he had delegated the task and waited for the outcome, comparing it to how he managed business affairs. Investigators considered they had what they needed. Yanowski had effectively placed himself at the center of the plot. He repeated his statements later the same day during a brief conversation with Sylvia, who was allowed to see him. She was devastated. Sylvia told investigators she could not understand what had happened. She said that while her mother could be difficult at times, she was generous and loving, and that she could not believe her partner was capable of such a crime. But the story did not end there. After confessing during his final night in custody, Yanowski retracted everything. At his first appearance before the investigating judge, he claimed his confession had been forced. He said he had been under intense pressure during questioning and compared the experience to the worst moments of his life, saying that what he went through in custody was worse than anything he had seen during World War II, including torture and concentration camps. The case moved to trial in September 2018. Yanowski's defense argued that he had acted only to protect Sylvia from an abusive mother. 13 days into the trial, the court made a decisive move. Recordings of Yanowski's police confessions were played in the courtroom. The effect was immediate. The recordings showed a calm, composed man speaking freely. The claim of coercion collapsed. Yanowski's defense unraveled in front of the jury. His lawyer, Eric Dupont-Moretti, eventually left the courtroom in frustration. On October 17, 2018, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Pascal Doriac was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Hamadi, the lookout, and Saeed Ahmed, the shooter, were sentenced to life imprisonment. And Wojciech Yanowski, identified as the mastermind, was also sentenced to